In this lecture, we're going to take a further examination of a range of general reflexes that exist that will enable a smoother movement of limbs and joints. And one such is referred to as the flexor reflex, and another is called the cross-extensor reflex. And in this example here, we're going to take a look at the influence of a pain-inducing stimulus and how it will generate reflexive actions in the limb. And these reflexes are much more complex in terms of the neural connections, and the magnitude of the reflex will often depend upon stimulus intensity. So that with a stronger stimulus, the reflex will tend to outlast the duration of the stimulus. In that case, movement is often faster with stimulus intensity. So this is a graded type of reflex. And the one example here is what is often referred to as the R3 reflex, and is typically a reflex that involves noxious stimuli or tissue damage inducing stimuli that would activate smaller diameter sensory neurons that would signal pain transmission to the central nervous system. And this is a reflex that has evolved over many generations of the human species as a protective type of reflex. It is considered polysynaptic, which includes many synaptic connections at the level of the spinal cord. So this will involve multiple interneuron communications both on the same side of the body and the opposite side of the body as well. And the purpose here is to help the coordination of bilateral limb movement, or rather reciprocal limb movement, and tends to be involuntary. So anytime we examine a reflex connection at the spinal cord level, it is considered to be involuntary. So on the right hand side of the slide, we're going to examine cutaneous information or cutaneous afferent action potentials generated from a nociceptor. And because it's cutaneous, this is coming from a sensory neuron embedded in the skin that is going to transmit information regarding skin puncture, a skin incision, or just generally skin damage, and that information will be transmitted along smaller diameter A delta fibers. These are sensory neurons that are smaller in diameter, lower amount of myelin, but when tissue, these are neurons that will signal tissue damage, and they will eventually generate a divergent connection. And so as you can see as we follow this diagram from this sensory neuron, once again we see the soma of this sensory neuron located in the dorsal root ganglion outside the spinal cord, but as it comes into the dorsal part of the gray matter, it starts to diverge and to branch and will synapse onto a number of different interneurons. These interneurons will have an effect on the muscles of the same limb. So this might be this would be the right leg, generating these noxious stimuli, and will also connect to interneurons that cross over that will affect the muscles of the left leg. And these inhibitory interneurons that you see right here will have an effect on inhibiting will inhibit the extensor muscle. And at the same time, this divergent connection will not only activate this inhibitory interneuron, but it will also activate an excitatory interneuron. This excitatory interneuron will synapse with alpha motor neurons that are connected to flexor muscles. And this is what is often referred to as the flexor withdrawal reflex in response to tissue damaging skin tissue, because this is coming from a cutaneous afferent signal. And so the withdrawal of the foot from the ground is generated because of these spinal connections, and that will produce activations on the left leg that is opposite to those of the right leg. So on the right leg, the extensor muscle is inhibited, the flexor is activated, producing the flexion response in the right knee, but on the left leg, the extensor muscle group is activated, the flexor is inhibited, so that when the right leg foot is removed from the ground, the left leg will reflexively contract the muscles so as to support body weight, and that's what allows the flexor response to occur. So generally, when we talk about reflexes, these are stereotyped, which means that if we apply the same stimulus, we'll get the same response every time. It's involuntary, which means that it's not under direct conscious control, and the connections here for these reflexes are at the spinal cord level, and they usually involve rapid responses to stimuli. And there are 4 general types of responses. The first is called the M1 response, and this is the type of response that is the fastest. The latency is about 30 to 50 milliseconds, and that is the monosynaptic stretch reflex, or the patellar tendon example of the stretch reflex. So there's only one synaptic connection on one leg, and that is the fastest type of connection that we can have in the nervous system. The M2 response has a longer latency of about 50 to 80 milliseconds, and these are reflexes often described as a functional stretch reflex, but are polysynaptic. So the polysynaptic are the ones that work through connections with interneurons. And because there's another connection, it's just going to take a little bit longer. That would induce neurotransmitter release, neurotransmitter recognition to produce action potentials in the interneuron that will cause another neurotransmitter release, as opposed to the M1, which only involves one neurotransmitter release in one connection. The M3 response has a latency that's longer than both M1 and M2, and this is voluntary reaction time. So voluntary reaction time is conscious, so that a person will perceive a stimulus and generate a muscular contraction to that stimulus. And because that information has to be communicated and interpreted in the brain, it has to travel a longer pathway, involve more synaptic connections, and will therefore take longer. The third type are what are called triggered reactions, and these have reactions that are somewhere between M2 and M3. And so these are reactions that are too fast to be purely voluntary, but are longer than M1 and M2 because of the polysynaptic nature of these reactions. And one example is responding to a trip while walking. And so that will involve spinal level connections, but that information is actually coordinated with areas in the cerebellum of the brain. And so because the cerebellum can operate much faster than perception in the sensory cortex, that will cause upper motor neuron activation in the motor cortex, which is conscious. This is an inherent pathway in the human central nervous system that allows people to respond to a trip while walking. So some of the purposes of reflexes, one of the purposes is to enhance muscle tone. And when we think about muscle tone, it's a very low level of force within the muscle that tends to resist muscle lengthening. So it's a slightly contracted state of skeletal muscle tissue. And this muscle tone serves a number of purposes. One very important purpose is to maintain upright posture. So whether upright posture is standing or even sitting, a person will tend to sway slightly. And the whole point of having a muscle that has a level of tone is that it will be able to respond to those body sways, and the reflexes will enhance corrective motions. Muscles do have the ability to store mechanical energy, not just chemical energy in fuels, but when a muscle is stretched, it can store that stretching energy and return it upon a later time. Usually this is very fast, that a stretched muscle will return that mechanical energy to the contraction phase of that muscle, and that will all carry out the third function to maintain muscle and joint stiffness. And so the quality of the muscle state will actually help with movements to be smoother. And so reflexes are governed in part by individual muscles themselves. So the feedback coming from sensory receptors, so for example, muscle action across a single joint, such as the knee extensors, will be regulated by the afferent information coming back to the central nervous system, originating from the actual muscle, and that will actually help to coordinate muscles across several joints. So one example of a muscle that acts across several joints is the biceps brachii, which crosses not just the elbow but also the shoulder joint. The myotatic unit is a term that refers to groups of muscles surrounding a joint that operates in an efficient manner by enhanced by reflexes. And one such reflexive action that helps to coordinate these muscles are from Golgi tendon organs and other sensory neurons. And so those sensory neurons will arise from muscle spindles, the joint itself, as well as the skin. And this myotatic unit and all of this sensory information will help to regulate the tone of the muscle. One other concept that we did not get into in great detail is something referred to as antagonistic inhibition. And so antagonistic inhibition is a term that refers to the simultaneous inhibition of a muscle that opposes a primary movement. So if the example is elbow flexion, the biceps brachii is a prime mover of elbow flexion. The triceps muscle which is the antagonistic muscle, will be inhibited. And the whole point of that reciprocal inhibition, or that antagonistic inhibition, is to enhance the speed of elbow flexion. As an example, if the triceps were activated to the same extent as the biceps muscle, the joint would not be able to move. And by doing so, it will enhance the efficiency of movement. So this ends this lecture on the overall function of reflexes.